the number 47. Patricia counted them every shift. 47 steps from the employee entrance to the first table, 11 more to the coffee station, 4 to the left to avoid the broken floor tile that management had been promising to fix since March. She knew the Morningstar diner the way most people know their own reflection, completely without having to think about it. The subway was different. The subway changed. New people every night. New smells. Someone's takeout bag rustling 3 seats down. The sharp chemical bite of someone's nail polish, still wet. A child's sneakers squeaking against the wet floor, then stopping. The city rearranging itself in the dark. Patricia stood with one hand around the pole and her cane pinned between her knees, trying to anchor herself to the one thing that didn't change. The stop sequence. 14 stops and then home. Her feet were sending urgent messages her brain had stopped accepting hours ago. Double shift. 6 tables of the Friday rush, plus the 2 corporate bookings in the back room where men in loud suits talked about things she couldn't quite hear and tipped exactly 15%, as if they'd calculated the minimum acceptable amount to avoid moral guilt. $61 tonight. She'd counted it twice in the break room, fingers reading the worn edges of the bills. The electric bill was $78. 12 stops. The train pitched hard around a curve she didn't expect. A line reroute, some mechanical ghost in the system, a deviation from the pattern she had memorized. Her hand slipped on the rain-slicked pole. The cane clattered sideways. Patricia had learned years ago not to grab blindly. Or grabbing blindly was how you knocked things over, how you made scenes, how you confirmed every terrible assumption strangers made about you in the first 3 seconds of meeting you. So she didn't grab. She fell. She had a half-second to brace for the hard plastic of a subway seat, the indignity of it, the embarrassment, the way she'd have to collect herself under someone's pitying stare. But the hard plastic never came. Instead, warmth, resistance, the dense, specific weight of a human lap, and the unmistakable texture of wool so fine it felt almost liquid against her cheek. Oh no. I'm sorry, I didn't. She pushed against the seat, or tried to. Her arms weren't cooperating. Her whole body had made a unilateral decision about the quality of what she'd landed on, and it was staging a quiet rebellion against her mortified mind. Or a hand came down on her shoulder, not grabbing, not groping, just placed there, with the certainty of someone who had never in their life needed to ask twice for anything. Don't. One word. She felt it more than heard it, a low frequency that seemed to move through the seat, through him, through her. The subway screeched. People shuffled. Somewhere to her left, she sensed the car going very still, in the way that a room full of people goes still when someone walks in who has changed the temperature of the air. She didn't understand it yet. She couldn't see the face, couldn't read the tattoos that climbed his throat, the ones running across his knuckles, the ones under his eye that every person in that car recognized and was now carefully avoiding looking at. She couldn't see the way the man across the aisle had suddenly found his phone very interesting. She couldn't see the couple near the doors shift 6 inches toward the exit. She couldn't see any of it. All she knew was that the hand on her shoulder was not unkind, and that she was, against all reason, against every self-preservation instinct she had developed over 31 years of navigating a world not built for her. She was not afraid. "Stay," the hand said, without saying anything at all. Her body answered before she had the chance to argue. The train rocked onward. Patricia Davidson, waitress, exhausted, $61 to her name, kept her cheek pressed against the expensive wool of a stranger's lap, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, closed her eyes without listening for danger. I woke up They wouldn't be anywhere near woke up. They wouldn't be anywhere near her exit. She had 14 stops to sleep. He had 365 days to plan. She slept for 6 stops before he counted them. Paul Sawyers had not been counted on to do anything gentle in a very long time. He ran figures in his head the way other men ran miles, constantly, efficiently, without sentiment, tonnage, percentages, the specific number of seconds it took for a man to change his mind when the alternative was introduced clearly enough. He dealt in quantities that mattered. He did not deal in sleeping women on subway trains at midnight. And yet, he had boarded the F train at 51st Street because his driver had pulled a muscle and his second car was across town, and Paul Sawyers, despite everything printed about him in the papers that dared to print anything at all, was not the kind of man who needed to make a scene about an inconvenience. He had settled into the corner seat in his Keaton charcoal pinstripe, the one his tailor in Naples had finished just 3 weeks ago, and he had been entirely prepared to spend 14 minutes thinking about the dockyard contract. Then the train had lurched. Then something had happened that hadn't happened to him since he was a different kind of man in a different kind of city. Someone had fallen on him without knowing who he was. Her cane had clattered. She'd gone down without a sound of protest. Her cheek had settled against his thigh. Her cheek had settled against his thigh, and she'd made a sound, barely audible, something between a sigh and a surrender. And then she'd gone completely, immediately still. Not unconscious. Something better? Something he recognized the way you recognize a thing you've forgotten you ever wanted. She was simply, finally, profoundly asleep. He looked at her for a long moment. The worn edge of her uniform collar, the small callus on her right palm from the cane handle, visible where her hand had fallen open. The faint smell of a diner, coffee and something fried, clinging to her despite what he guessed was an attempt to cover it with something light and floral. A body spray rather than perfume, the kind that came in a drugstore bottle. He did not move her. He wasn't entirely sure why. The man seated 2 spots down, heavy-set, sporting a football jersey and the particular restless energy of someone who had already had 4 drinks, noticed her first. He leaned forward with the expression of a man about to say something he thought was friendly. Paul turned his head. Just his head. Slowly. The way a camera pans in the moment before the subject of a photograph realizes it's been taken. The man in the jersey sat back. He became very interested in his phone. He did not look up again for the remainder of the journey. A teenager near the door started to drift closer, reaching for the overhead rail directly above them, the natural, thoughtless movement of a crowded train. Paul's hand came up from his knee. One finger pointed once at the next section of rail, 6 feet down. The teenager relocated without being entirely sure why. This was how it went for 11 stops. Paul Sawyers, who had not done anything this quiet in years, kept the small radius around her undisturbed through nothing more than the precise application of his attention. No words, no movement worth noting, just the specific gravity of a man who had learned that violence was most efficient when it never needed to occur. She didn't wake up when she should have. Her stop came and went. He'd found the address on the small emergency card clipped to her cane strap, a habit of someone who had learned to prepare for falls. And she didn't stir. The train emptied at the terminal. A janitor appeared at the far end of the car with a mop, took one look, and found something to clean on a different train entirely. Paul sat in the silence of the empty car and considered the situation with the same deliberate attention he gave to acquisitions. She was not a liability. She was not an opportunity. She was a woman who had fallen asleep on him without a single calculation behind it, which was, he realized, sitting in the fluorescent quiet, something that had never happened to him before. Every person in his life approached him having already done the math, having already decided what they wanted from him, having already composed their face into the correct expression. She had composed nothing. She'd just landed. He lifted his phone and made a single call, 3 words, to bring the car. Then he sat very still and listened to her breathe until the black car pulled up at the terminal service entrance, and he did the thing that surprised him more than any of it. He was careful when he lifted her, not to wake her up. If you are loving this story already, subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. The Cartier on his wrist read 1:07 a.m. She had been asleep for 41 minutes. He already knew he wasn't taking her home. The first thing Patricia noticed was the silence. Not the silence of her apartment on Delancey Street, which was never truly silent. The pipes speaking in the walls, the neighbor's television bleeding through the floor, Mark's particular brand of stillness that was less peaceful and more absence. This was a different quality of quiet entirely. Not the kind that cost something, the kind that was engineered. The second thing she noticed was the sheets. She had worked enough hotel cleaning shifts in a previous life to know thread count by touch, the way a jeweler knows grade by weight. These were somewhere north of 600. Egyptian cotton, probably. The kind that didn't so much cover you as receive you, the way warm water does. She lay still for a moment, her hands open against the surface, reading it the way she read most things, through her palms, through the information her fingers gathered without being asked. Cool air. Climate-controlled. Not a window unit. The faint trace of cedar and something mineral. A candle, expensive, recently extinguished. Carpet underfoot when she swung her legs over the edge, thick enough to register the difference in pressure. High floor. Seated, unhurried, the voice of a man. Seated, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been waiting without minding the wait. "You took my train," Patricia said. She was proud of how level it came out. "You took my lap," Paul replied. "We're even." She heard him rise, heard the quiet displacement of a chair, the soft fall of footsteps across the carpet, the particular acoustic signature of a large room. He stopped at what she estimated was 8 feet away, close enough to speak normally, far enough to be deliberate. Something was set on the surface beside her, the nightstand from the sound of it. The smell reached her immediately. Coffee, fresh, and beside it the warm yeast and butter certainty of a croissant from somewhere that was not a chain. "There's a contract on the table," he said. Patricia didn't reach for the coffee. "I'm blind." "I'm aware. It will be read to you. The terms are straightforward." A pause. 365 days. You stay. You live here. You want for nothing. You are untouched and unharmed. At the end of the year, $5 million is transferred into an account in your name only. Another pause, smaller. If you fall in love with me before the year is up, the money is still yours. Patricia sat with that for a moment. And if I want to leave? The life you have on Delancey Street continues exactly as it is. The words were measured, each one placed carefully. The diner, the late notices. No, the arrangement you've made with a man who speaks about you differently when you're not in the room. The coffee was going to go cold. She reached for it anyway, found the cup handle on her first try, which she suspected he noticed, and took a slow sip. Single origin, she thought, poured from a Chemex or something similar. Nothing about this apartment was accidental. "I want to go home," she said. "To Mark." Paul said nothing for a moment. Then, "All right." That surprised her. She had prepared for resistance, for the low-frequency command she'd felt on the train, for the immovable weight of his particular gravity. Instead, he simply moved to the door, and she heard him speak briefly to someone in the hall. Instructions for a car, her address recited back exactly. She found her shoes at the foot of the bed. Down himself. An elevator, fast and down himself. An elevator, fast and smooth, Thassos marble underfoot from the feel and sound of it. A lobby, automatic doors, the city arriving all at once, exhaust and cold air and the mechanical grinding of a delivery truck, like a record playing at the wrong speed after the controlled silence upstairs. A car door opened. She found the seat. "The number," Paul said from above her, unhurried as ever, "is in the right pocket of the coat on the seat beside you. When you're ready." When? Not if. Patricia kept her face still. The door closed. The car pulled out into traffic. She reached beside her and found the coat immediately. Cashmere, heavy, or the kind with a lining that warmed before you expected it to, folded neatly on the seat. She did not reach into the pocket. She sat with her hands in her lap for 4 blocks, then 3 more. Then she thought about Mark, about the sound of his voice at the end of a bad week, about the particular pitch his anger took when the tips weren't enough, about the smell of someone else's perfume on the couch cushions that she had not mentioned because she had not known what to do with the knowing. Her hand moved to the pocket on the 7th block. She didn't take the number out. She just held it in her palm, a small folded rectangle of cardstock, thick, engraved. She could feel the lettering pressed into the surface. And she held it the way you hold something you aren't ready to use and aren't ready to throw away. The car moved uptown. As she rode it all the way home, the key was still under the 3rd step. Mark had never understood why she insisted on hiding it there instead of the magnetic box attached to the railing like a reasonable person. Patricia had never explained that the magnetic box made a specific click when it opened, audible from inside the apartment, and that she had long preferred to know whether she was walking into a good night or a bad one before she crossed the threshold. The key under the step was silent. The key under the step gave her 3 extra seconds. She listened at the door. Television. A pre-game show, the kind with 4 men talking over each other about statistics. A glass set down on the coffee table. The cheap one from the discount furniture place on Atlantic Avenue, or the one with the wobble on the left leg she'd asked him to fix in February. The particular rhythm of a man who had been sitting for a long time and had no intention of stopping. She turned the key and went in. "Where have you been?" Not a question. Mark delivered it the way he delivered most things, as a conclusion already reached, needing only confirmation. She heard him shift on the couch, heard the creak of the cushion springs that she'd been meaning to look up how to fix, and she set her cane against the wall in its place and kept her voice easy. "I fell asleep on the train. I missed my stop." "You missed your stop." The repetition carried its own particular weight. "How much did you make tonight?" Patricia set her bag on the kitchen counter. $61. The electric bill was $78, or she had already done this math 14 times since the train terminal, and the answer had not improved. 61. The silence that followed was its own kind of speech. She heard him pick up his glass, set it back down harder than he needed to. "I've been waiting 3 hours, he said. "I was going to order food. There's rice in the pot from yesterday, and I can make eggs." "I don't want eggs, Patricia." She moved through the kitchen the way she moved through every room she'd memorized, without hesitation, without the tentative sweep of someone performing blindness for an audience. 14 steps from the door to the counter, 7 to the stove. She filled a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, listening to the apartment settle around her, reading it the way she read every space. Something was different. She set the glass down and stayed still for a moment, cataloguing. The television, the wobble-legged table, Mark's breathing, which had the specific cadence of someone nursing a mood rather than expressing it. The faint smell of the takeout containers she could tell were in the trash, even though he'd tied the bag. General Tso's, from the place 3 blocks over that she never ordered from because the sodium made her ankles swell. And something else. She turned toward the living room, unhurried, the way you turn when you don't want the turning to mean anything. Made her way to the couch on the pretext of sitting, of offering the proximity that sometimes smoothed his edges on difficult nights. She settled at the far end and let her hand rest on the nearest cushion. Cashmere. Not from this apartment. Not a scent so delicate and expensive that it had to be an extravagance. The kind of fragrance that came in bottles shaped like sculpture and cost more than Patricia made in a week of double shifts. Light, powdery, with something underneath it that was green and warm. Not her fragrance. She did not own anything that cost more than a drugstore bottle. She kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. She had learned it young, the particular composure of someone who processes information privately, because processing it publicly had too often invited pity or suspicion. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm going to lie down." Mark said nothing. The pre-game analysts argued about a quarterback's form. She moved through the bedroom, changed in the dark that wasn't dark to her, and lay on her side of the bed. Her side being precise, because the other side had a slight depression toward the middle that she'd always found uncomfortable. She lay on top of the covers because the sheets needed washing and she hadn't gotten to it, and that was, somehow, the detail that finally made her chest tighten. Not the perfume. Not the takeout for one. Not the $61 versus $78. The sheets that needed washing. The step that needed fixing. The life that had the shape of a life, but had been slowly, quietly emptied of its contents so gradually that she had confused the echo for the thing itself. She reached into the pocket of her uniform. The cardstock was still there. Thick, engraved. The lettering pressed into the surface with the permanent confidence of a man who did not expect his number to go uncalled. No, she didn't take it out. She just kept her fingers on it in the dark. Outside, a cab horn, the neighbor's television, the ordinary, patient noise of a life she had stopped hearing until tonight, when something had offered her a different kind of silence, and she had made the mistake of remembering what quiet felt like when it wasn't just emptiness wearing a familiar face. She lay still until Mark's snoring began. Then she took the card out and read it with her fingertips in the dark, letter by letter, until she had memorized it. Just in case, she waited 4 days. She was not sure, afterward, why 4 specifically. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't pride, though she had plenty of that, the particular kind that develops in people who have learned that asking for help too quickly teaches the world to expect it. She thought it might have been something closer to grief, the specific, unglamorous grief of watching something you'd already half buried finally stop moving. On the 2nd day, Mark came home in a good mood and brought her flowers from the bodega on the corner, the cheap carnations wrapped in plastic that she could identify by their faint chemical sweetness, and she had put them in the blue vase on the windowsill and said, "Thank you," and stood there for a long moment with her hands around the cool ceramic, thinking about thread counts. On the 3rd day, she called her sister's phone number, which had been disconnected since November. On the 4th day, she called Paul's. He answered on the 2nd ring, which told her he had been waiting without performing patience. No greeting, just the low, unhurried certainty of his voice. "What, where are you?" she told him. The car arrived in 11 minutes. Not the same driver as before. This one didn't speak, which she appreciated. She sat in the back with her hands folded and the cashmere throw from the last ride still on the seat, as though the car had simply been waiting with it kept warm. He met her in the lobby of the glass tower. She knew it was him before he spoke, the particular displacement of air that came with his height, the faint trace of his cologne, something dark and resinous that she was beginning to file under a category she hadn't named yet. "You waited 4 days," he said. "I'm here now," she replied. He took her upstairs. The elevator, the marble, the engineered silence of the apartment closing around her like a door easing shut on the rest of the city. He seated her on something long and deep, a sofa, Italian leather from the sound and give of it, and she heard him move across the room to what she'd catalogued on her first visit as the desk. "I need you to listen to something," he said. "I want you to hear it completely before you respond. Can you do that?" Patricia folded her hands in her lap. "Yes." The recording was 18 minutes long. She knew Mark's voice within the first 3 seconds, the way you know a sound that has structured your mornings for 7 years. He was speaking with someone she didn't recognize, a man with a flat, professional affect, legal or financial, the voice of someone billing by the hour. The conversation was precise, organized. It had clearly happened more than once, this particular conversation, because they spoke with the shorthand of people revisiting a plan rather than forming one. The words cognitive decline appeared in the 7th minute, power of attorney in the 9th, disability benefit consolidation in the 11th, delivered by Mark in the patient tone of a man describing a project timeline. Patricia did not move. She had learned, young, that stillness was not the same as absence, that you could be completely, electrically present inside a body that showed the world nothing at all. She sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, and she listened to her husband discuss the architecture of her diminishment with the same careful attention she gave to every room she needed to memorize. The recording ended. The room was very quiet. She was not sure, precisely, when the stillness became something else, at once in a way that was somehow still, once in a way that was somehow still quiet. Her hands unfolded. Her shoulders dropped a degree. Something behind her sternum released, and what replaced it was a specific, exhausting blankness, the feeling of a belief system vacating its premises. She heard Paul move. Not toward her. He crossed to the window and stood there, and she understood, somehow, that he was giving her the room without leaving it. Presence without pressure. The particular respect of a man who knew the difference. She did not cry for long. She was not built for long. When she finished, he was beside her on the sofa, close, not touching, the warmth of him simply available. On the low table in front of her, "Or contract," she said. "The contract." He contract, she said. "The contract," he confirmed. She reached forward, found the pen he'd left beside it, already uncapped, the weight of it substantial in her palm. A Mont Blanc, she thought, by the heft. She signed where he guided her hand. Twice, her signature clean and certain, because Patricia Davidson had never in her life done anything halfway. "Day 1, Paul said quietly. Outside, the city moved on without her. She sat in the engineered silence of the glass tower and felt, underneath the wreckage of the last 18 minutes, something that surprised her entirely. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, or had rooms within 3 days. Counting had rooms within 3 days, counting steps between furniture, cataloguing the acoustic signature of each space, learning how sound moved differently through the open kitchen versus the narrow corridor that led to the east wing. She meant she had memorized it, the way you memorize a piece of music you've decided to keep. The way the morning light changed the temperature of the air near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hinge on the study door that tightened in cold weather. The particular resonance of the apartment when Paul was in it versus when he wasn't. A difference she couldn't entirely explain and had stopped trying to. He had given her the second bedroom, which was larger than her entire apartment on Delancey Street. The closet had been stocked by someone with taste and discretion. She'd learned this by touch, working through each garment methodically on her first evening, finding silk where she expected polyester, finding cashmere where she expected cotton, finding a row of shoes in her exact size, each pair different in heel height and occasion, organized left to right from casual to formal, in an arrangement so logical it had briefly taken her breath away. Someone had thought about her in her absence. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She settled into the rhythms of the household, the way she settled into every new space, by becoming fluent in it before anyone noticed she was studying. The meetings began in the 8th week. Paul brought her the first time without explanation, which she'd come to understand was his particular communication style. He simply appeared in the doorway of the sitting room one morning and said, "I have a 9 o'clock," and waited. She found her jacket, a Loro Piana blazer in dove grey that she knew by the weight of the buttons, and followed him down. The conference room was on a lower floor, accessed by a private elevator, requiring a key she now carried on a chain. 12 chairs around the table, she counted by listening to them scrape and settle as men arrived. 8 men total that first morning. The air thickened with expensive watches and unearned confidence, the specific atmosphere of people who had never been questioned about anything in a room this size. She sat beside Paul and poured herself water from the carafe and said nothing, which was easy because nobody addressed her. She was furniture. She understood this immediately and completely, and she filed it without resentment, because resentment was a luxury that got in the way of information. A man named Doyle, she catalogued him as a smoker with a northeastern accent and at least one broken nose, healed badly from the slightly occluded quality of his breathing, spoke freely about a shipping arrangement at the port of Newark, with a specificity she found remarkable, given that a stranger was present. The man to his left, whom she privately named Herringbone for his jacket fabric, discussed a city councilman's schedule with the casual authority of someone who received that schedule regularly. Nobody looked at her. Well, she knew this because nobody modulated their voice toward her. Nobody paused mid-sentence the way people do when they remember an audience. Nobody performed even the minimal social adjustment of someone aware they were being observed. A blind woman in a chair was not a witness. She was a prop, an accessory the boss had brought for reasons the men around the table had already dismissed as personal and therefore irrelevant. Patricia sat with her hands folded on the table and her face composed and her mind recording. She began keeping notes in a method she'd developed years ago, a Braille shorthand she'd adapted from the standard, faster, more compressed, legible only to her. She kept the small note-taker in her jacket pocket, its keys silent under the pad of her thumb. She made no obvious movements. She had spent 31 years making no obvious movements. By the 4th meeting, she had Doyle's shipping contact, the councilman's name, the outline of a debt arrangement involving a restaurant group on the West Side, and the first name of someone 2 levels above Herringbone, who nobody ever referred to directly, but whose opinions were cited the way people cite weather, as a condition to be managed rather than a choice to be made. Paul never asked what she heard. She never offered it. But one evening, 3 months in, he was working at the study desk when she paused in the doorway and said, simply and without preamble, "Doyle is moving more than timber through Newark." The pen stopped. "I know," Paul said, after a moment. Then you know he's splitting the margin with someone inside your operation. She kept her voice conversational, the way she kept everything. Third chair, left side of the table, herringbone jacket. The silence that followed had a different quality than his usual ones. This one had weight. Recalibration, she thought. The specific sound of a man updating his understanding of a situation. "Sit down, Patricia," he said finally. She found the chair across from his desk. The leather was Connolly hide, she'd decided, firm and cool and permanent. "From the beginning," he said. "Tell me everything." She settled back in the chair, folded her hands, and began. The war came the way most things came in Paul's world, announced by its absence first. Meetings that ended too quickly, phone calls taken in other rooms, the specific quality of silence that settles over a household when everyone in it knows something is wrong and has been instructed not to say so. Patricia tracked it the way she tracked everything, through texture and temperature, through the way the apartment breathed differently when Paul was carrying something he hadn't put down in days. She didn't ask. Asking was for people who needed to be told things. Patricia waited, and the things came to her. It was a Tuesday in the 4th month when he came home at 2 a.m. and didn't go to the study. She heard the elevator, heard him move through the apartment with the slow, deliberate steps of a man conserving something. The liquor cabinet in the sitting room opened and closed. Then nothing, or just the particular stillness of a person standing in a dark room, deciding whether to keep standing. She appeared in the doorway in her robe, silk, deep navy, something she'd found hanging in her closet one morning without comment, and said, "There's coffee." From an hour ago, still warm enough. A pause. "You should be asleep." "I was reading." She moved to the kitchen, found the carafe, poured 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one, because men in this particular state always wanted something warm and almost never asked for it. She set them on the low table in the sitting room and settled into her corner of the sofa. After a moment, she heard him cross the room and sit. Not at the opposite end. Closer than that. The cushion beside her registering his weight, the warmth of him arriving before he fully settled, or for a while. This was the thing Patricia for a while. This was the thing Patricia had noticed, incrementally, over the weeks. The way the silence between them had changed its character. Early on, it had been the silence of 2 people in a standoff, each waiting for the other to reveal terms. Then it had become something more neutral, 2 people sharing space without the social obligation to fill it. Now it was something she didn't have a clean word for, something that had weight without being heavy. "How many people know you're worried?" she asked eventually. "None," he said. "Then you've been performing for months." He didn't answer immediately. She heard him turn the cup in his hands, the Christoffel silver one he favored. She knew it by the ring it made against his Patek Philippa when his wrist turned. Everything about him was precise, curated, intentional. The suit, the posture, the absolute economy of his expressions that she'd been told about, second-hand, by the way rooms rearranged themselves when he entered. She had never seen any of it. She only knew the version of him that existed at 2 a.m. in a dark sitting room, holding a coffee cup with both hands. "There's a family moving into the port corridor," he said at last. The words came out without their usual architecture, no careful placement, just information released from the pressure of being held too long. They're not negotiating. They don't negotiate, or they establish. And your people are watching you to see if you're afraid. My people are always watching. Then you're never alone in a room, Patricia said. It wasn't a question. Another silence. Longer this time. Outside, a siren somewhere below, diminishing. "No," he said. "I'm not." She reached forward and set her cup down, and the gesture was so unhurried, so entirely without the performance of significance, that she almost didn't say what came next. But the 4 months had built something between them that she was no longer pretending not to notice. A structure assembled in quiet increments, in shared coffee and late evenings, and the particular trust of a man who had stopped being careful around her without seeming to decide to. "You don't have to, right now," she said. "Be alone in it." He was quiet for so long she thought the conversation had ended. Then she felt him lean back against the sofa, the tension in the cushion beside her, shifting and releasing slightly, the way a held breath releases. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She heard the change in his breathing, the gradual slowing of it, the way a man sounds when he has finally, privately, put something down. They sat in the manufactured quiet of the glass tower, while the city did its restless, insomniac work below them. Paul Sawyers, who had not been soft in front of anyone in longer than he could precisely remember, sat beside a woman who couldn't see his face. For the first time in longer than he could measure, it didn't cost him anything. Patricia listened to him breathe and said nothing, and understood, with a clarity that arrived not like a revelation, but like a room she'd been walking toward for months, and had simply now entered, that this specific stillness, the two of them in it, was the most honest place either of them had been in years. She didn't say so. She filed it quietly, the way she filed everything. The coffee went cold. Neither of them moved. She heard them before anyone else did. Not because her hearing was extraordinary. She had never claimed that, had actively resisted the mythology people wanted to build around her blindness, the compensation narrative that made sighted people more comfortable with her condition than she was required to be. She heard them because she was awake at 11:43 on a Thursday in the 7th month, sitting in the study with her note-taker in her lap. And she was paying attention in the way she always paid attention, completely, without the distraction of anything to look at. The elevator didn't come from the lobby. It came from the service level. 2 floors below the penthouse, the secondary shaft that ran alongside the building's utility spine. She knew its sound intimately by now, a slightly lower register than the main elevator, a fractional delay in the cable tension. She had noted it in her first week, and filed it under the category of things nobody had bothered to tell her, because nobody had thought she would notice. She stood up. The lights went out 4 seconds later. The effect on the apartment was immediate and revealing. She heard it in the voices first. The guard near the main entrance. A man named Briggs, whose size she'd estimated at 6'3" by where his voice originated, saying something sharp into his radio that received no response. Another guard, somewhere in the corridor, moving too fast in a direction that suggested he was navigating by memory and finding his memory insufficient. The crash of something, a lamp, she thought. Murano glass by the pitch of the shatter, the expensive one from the console table. Confirmed it. Then the door came in. Not the front door. The service entrance off the kitchen corridor, which told her they had been in the building for longer than the last 4 seconds, that the power cut was a signal rather than a preparation. She moved immediately, not away from the sound, but perpendicular to it, into the interior of the apartment, counting under her breath the way she counted everything. 12 steps from the study door to the sitting room threshold, left 4 steps, avoid the Hermes trunk that Paul used as a side table. 8 steps to the fireplace, her hand finding the carved marble mantel at the exact height she expected it. The sitting room had become chaos in the dark. She heard at least 4 different sets of feet, some belonging to Paul's men, some not, distinguished by purpose. Purposeful movement sounds different from panicked movement. And right now, Paul's guards were panicked, colliding with furniture, disoriented in a space they'd believed they knew. She heard Paul. He was to her left and ahead, maybe 15 feet, his voice issuing 2 short commands that were immediately swallowed by the noise. Then a sound she had no category for, and immediately created one. A sharp, contained percussion, followed by Paul's voice, dropping mid-word into something lower and compressed. He'd been hit. She didn't pause to process it. Processing was for afterward, for when the information could be useful. She moved along the fireplace mantel, both hands on the marble, counting the decorative insets by feel. 1, 2, 3 relief panels, each 8 inches wide, and then the 4th, which was flush where the others had depth, seamless to anyone who hadn't spent 7 months running her fingers across every surface in this apartment out of the simple habit of knowing where she was. She pressed the lower left corner of the 4th panel, heard the mechanism, felt the give. The wall opened inward 6 inches. Oh, Paul. She kept her voice low and directional, aimed at where she'd last heard him. Left wall. Fireplace. Now. A beat. She heard him moving, slower than normal, one hand likely occupied, the particular asymmetry of someone managing an injury without acknowledging it. Someone else's feet started toward her from the wrong direction, a stranger's feet, and she stepped back into the open panel and simply waited, because a dark room was not the same problem for everyone. He found her by her voice. 1 syllable. His name, said once more, quietly. The way you call something you're certain will come. His hand found the doorframe. She caught his arm, felt the warmth of something wrong above his elbow, didn't comment on it, and drew him inside. The panel clicked shut behind them. The panic room was narrow, 3 feet of space, perhaps 4, designed for concealment rather than comfort. She could feel him against her in the dark, his breathing altered by pain and by the effort of controlling the pain, his back against the interior wall, and her hand still on his arm. Outside, the chaos continued its ugly work. Glass, voices, the methodical destruction of expensive things by people who understood that destruction was its own kind of message. Inside the wall, there was only the dark. Paul's breathing slowed by degrees. She felt him register, gradually, that she had not moved, had not trembled, had not reached for him in the panicked way of someone needing reassurance. She simply stood in the lightless space with the steadiness of someone for whom lightless spaces had never been the crisis. You knew where it was, he said. Barely a sound, a movement of air. I know where everything is, she said. A long silence. Outside, someone was shouting in a language she didn't recognize. Inside, Paul Sawyers leaned his head back against the wall of the hidden room, wounded and contained and kept, and she felt the moment he stopped fighting the reality of it, the dark, the pain, the particular indignity of needing to be hidden by the one person in his life he'd assumed he was protecting. She kept her hand on his arm, not to comfort, just to monitor, just to know. He let her. The first 10 minutes were the longest. Patricia counted them by Paul's breathing, not precisely, not with a clock, but in the way she had learned to measure time inside spaces where time was the only variable she could track. His inhale was still too shallow, yet the injury above his elbow had soaked through to her palm, where her hand remained on his arm, warm and slow, not arterial, which she had assessed in the first 30 seconds and filed under manageable. She didn't tell him she'd assessed it. Men like Paul required information delivered at the right moment, and the right moment was not while they were listening to their apartment being dismantled 12 inches away. The sounds came in layers, The initial chaos had peaked quickly. She'd heard at least 3 of Paul's guards regroup, heard them find their footing in the dark, with the belated efficiency of professionals who had recovered from their surprise. The intruders were fewer than they'd sounded in the first panicked minute. 4, she estimated. Maybe 5. The advantage of the dark had belonged to them for exactly as long as it takes a trained man to remember his training. Now it belonged to no one equally, which meant it belonged to the side with more discipline. She tracked the movement outside by sound and by the vibration that travelled through the wall at her back. The Venetian plaster, she thought absently, the kind applied in 7 layers by the craftsman Paul had flown in from Treviso, who had spent 2 weeks in the apartment and spoken to no one. All of that care and craft, shuddering now against her shoulder blades, while strangers moved through it with bad intentions. Paul shifted beside her. She tightened her hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. He went still. She felt him make the decision. Not submission, something more deliberate than that, but the choice of a man who had enough information to know that the person beside him had more of it than he did in this particular moment. The space between them was minimal. The panic room had been designed for concealment, not habitation, barely wider than a door frame, deep enough for 2 people standing close, shelved on the right side with equipment she had catalogued months ago by touch during one of her solitary explorations of the apartment while Paul was elsewhere. A medical kit on the second shelf. 2 flashlights she had deliberately not reached for tonight, because light beneath a door is visible, and she was not ready for them to be found. A radio, manual frequency, which she had also not touched yet. She became aware, in the specific intimacy of the narrow space, of the precise quality of his stillness. To Paul Sawyers was not a man who was still by nature. She had learned this over 7 months of close proximity, learned it through the small movements he made when thinking, the pen turned in his fingers at the desk, the way he stood at the window with his weight shifting almost imperceptibly. He was still now the way things are still under pressure, contained rather than calm, but he was letting her lead. She understood this without ceremony, without marking it as the significant thing it was. Outside, a voice gave a short command. A door, the main entrance, she thought, opened and then closed, footsteps receding toward the elevator corridor. Then another set, slower, and Briggs's voice saying something low and confirming into a radio that was now working again. The quality of the chaos changed, but it was reorganizational now rather than active. The violence had finished its work and left the cleanup behind. She reached for the second shelf, found the medical kit by the latch she'd memorized, a pelican case, hard-sided, the good kind, and opened it against her hip where the sound was muffled. "Give me your arm," she said. He did, without the performance of reluctance that most men in his position would have offered, without the deflection. Just extended his arm toward her in the dark, and she took it in both hands and worked by feel, which was how she worked best, her fingers reading the wound with the clinical attention of someone who had taken 3 first aid courses over the years, because the world had taught her early that she could not always wait for someone else to manage a crisis. The graze was clean, not deep enough to matter, not deep enough to be the thing that ended him tonight. She dressed it with the quiet efficiency of someone focusing on the task rather than the person, though the person was impossible to ignore at this proximity. His warmth, his breathing, the way he watched her even in total darkness, the weight of attention she could feel the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. "You navigated to me," he said, while she worked, low, the particular voice he used when he wasn't performing anything. "In all of that, you came directly to me." I knew where you were. How? You always stand in the same place during a difficult conversation, she said. Left of center in whatever room you're in, near enough to the exit to have options, far enough not to seem concerned about them. She secured the dressing, what I've been mapping you for months. The silence that followed was the most specific one she had catalogued in 7 months of living inside his silences. She felt it land somewhere in him and stay there. I brought you here to protect you, he said. I know. That's not what happened tonight. No, she agreed. It isn't. Outside, Briggs knocked twice on the panel in the sequence Paul had established. She had memorized this too, on principle, and she stepped back to let Paul reach the release. The panel opened inward. The emergency lighting had come on in the apartment, a dim amber wash, and she felt the change in the air immediately, the room breathing again around them. Paul stepped out first. She heard him take in what remained of the apartment, the Murano glass she'd identified by its shatter, the displaced furniture, the Hermes trunk overturned in the sitting room. A season of curated, deliberate beauty rearranged in 12 minutes by people who understood that destruction was the cheapest kind of power. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the open panel, toward her, and she understood from the quality of the silence that he was looking at her with something that had been building for months and had finally run out of room to stay contained. She didn't ask him to say it. She had learned that things named too quickly lost their shape. She simply stepped out of the dark and into the amber light of the ruined room, her hand finding her cane where she had left it against the wall that morning. And she stood beside him in the wreckage and said nothing, because nothing was precisely what the moment needed. Or Paul Sawyers stood in the ruins of everything he had built and said, Patricia. Just that. Just her name, in the voice he used when he wasn't performing anything. She turned toward it. Day 366 arrived the way significant things often do, indistinguishable from the day before it, until it wasn't. Patricia knew the date without being told. She had counted every one of the preceding 365 days with the same quiet methodology she applied to everything, marking them not in a calendar, but in the accumulation of small details that constitute a life lived somewhere long enough to call it somewhere. The way the morning light shifted through the new floor-to-ceiling glass, the restoration had taken 6 weeks, said the same Venetian craftsman, returning with his plaster and his silence, and fell differently in November than it had in the February she'd arrived. The way she now navigated the rebuilt apartment without counting steps, her body having absorbed the geography of it, the way a language becomes fluent, the way you stop translating and simply speak. She was in the sitting room when Paul came in at 9 in the morning, which was late for him. She heard it in his pace, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had decided something and was carrying the decision carefully. He sat across from her, set something on the table between them. She didn't reach for it. She waited. The year is fulfilled, he said. The threat is neutralized. Doyle's arrangement has been dismantled. Or the family in the port corridor reached terms in September. A pause. You were in the room for 2 of those conversations. I remember, she said. The account was established last week. 5 million, as agreed. The transfer clears today. Another pause, smaller. The contract is on the table, signed and fulfilled on both sides. You're free to go, Patricia. She sat with the words. Outside, the city moved through its November morning, indifferent and continuous. A cab horn far below, the distant percussion of construction somewhere east, the ordinary music of a world that had continued without particular interest in what was happening in this room. She reached forward and found the contract, the same thick paper as the beginning, but worn now at the fold lines from having been handled, consulted, referenced over the course of a year. Her fingers moved across the surface, reading it the way she read everything important, completely, without rushing, giving each part its due attention. At the bottom, her signature, clean and certain, exactly as she'd made it that first morning with the Mont Blanc in her hand and the wreckage of 18 minutes of recorded audio still settling through her. She held the document in both hands and thought about Delancey Street, about the pipes in the walls and the wobble-legged table and $61 in a worn apron pocket, about the sound of a life that had the shape of a life, but had been quietly, systematically emptied of its contents by a man who had seen her blindness as an opportunity rather than a characteristic. She thought about the first night in this apartment, waking in 600 thread count sheets in a silence that cost something. She thought about a shipping contact memorized in a conference room where no one thought to look at her, about Herringbone's jacket and Doyle's breathing and 2 of the 4 conversations Paul had just referenced, which she had also privately documented in her compressed Braille shorthand in case the documentation was ever necessary. She thought about a panic room 3 feet wide, and a man who had extended his arm in the dark without ceremony or resistance, and the specific quality of his voice when he had said her name in the amber light of a ruined room, and the silence that had followed, and what she had understood about herself in that silence. She thought about being seen, not watched. She had been watched her entire life. What the particular surveillance that society performs on people it considers fragile, the monitoring gaze of pity dressed as concern. She meant seen, the understanding of a person that arrives not from looking, but from attention, from the accumulated weight of months of mornings and late evenings, and coffee gone cold and difficult truths delivered without softening, from a man who had never once, in 365 days, made her blindness the thing he led with, who had stocked her closet with garments organized by occasion because logic was a form of respect, who had sat in the dark of a sitting room at 2 a.m. and put something down because she had made it possible to put it down, who knew, precisely and without sentiment, what she was capable of, because he had been paying attention. Patricia Davidson sat in the morning quiet of the glass tower and understood that she had spent 31 years being looked past and 8 months being known, and that the distance between those 2 experiences was not negotiable, was not something she could return from, was not a thing she was willing to give back for $5 million and an apartment on Delancey Street with pipes in the walls. She tore the contract in half. The sound was clean and final, the good paper resisting and then yielding, the way most things yield when you've made an actual decision rather than a provisional one. She set both halves on the table and folded her hands in her lap. The room was very quiet. "Patricia," Paul said, the voice with no architecture in it, the 2 a.m. voice. "I'm aware of what I'm doing," she said. "What I want that noted. It's noted. I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go. I have $5 million and more information about your operation than anyone in this city except you." She kept her voice level, the way she kept everything. "I'm staying because this is the only room I've ever been in where the lights being on or off doesn't change what anyone sees when they look at me." She heard him exhale, not the compressed, controlled exhale of a man managing himself, the other kind. Then his hand came across the table and covered both of hers, heavy, warm, ringed, the same hand that had pressed her shoulder down on a midnight train and said, "Don't," and meant "you're safe." And he held them without speaking, because he had learned, over the course of a year, that she did not require words to receive information. She turned her hands over and held his in return. Outside, the city. Below, the ordinary world with its ordinary distances between people. Up here in the engineered silence of the glass tower, Patricia sat in the room she had memorized completely and felt, moving through her with the quiet certainty of a thing that had been true for months and was only now being said aloud, that she was exactly, precisely, finally where she had decided to be. Not where she'd fallen, where she'd chosen. The torn contract sat on the table between them. Neither of them moved to clear it away.